Welcome to the CEO DNA podcast. Here it's all about getting more knowledge and wisdom to all those CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs out there. And today I have somebody very special, the founder of the entrepreneurship organization with over 18,000 members and also the best-selling author of so many books. A couple of my favorite is for sure The Greatest Business Decision of All Time and for sure Scaling Up. So welcome, Verne Harnish.
Michael, good to be on the podcast.
So what is the DNA of a good CEO for you?
Well, first, I like to separate the difference between an owner and a CEO. And I assume we've got a lot of also owners, entrepreneurs, and their number one job is valuation, to scale the valuation of the business. And their number one decision is who they should hire as CEO. And since many of them might be wearing two hats, they might consider firing themselves, and hiring a CEO. And our view is there are 4 jobs of a CEO. And by the way, that's not me saying it. This is Michael Porter at Harvard. This is Hubert Joly, who turned around Best Buy, who's now teaching at the Harvard Business School as well. And the number one job is strategy. Their job is to set strategy. And it's a lonely job. I love when CEOs make a singular decision that everybody else on the leadership team thinks might be crazy. It was when Steve Jobs decided to open up Apple stores. Everybody, the board, the media, his executive team, there was nobody who supported that idea. But Steve said, look, I understand we're going to open stores. And the rest is history. Their second job then is to choose the leadership team. And again, using Steve as an example, when he came back to save his baby Apple, he identified not 500, not 50, but 5 key people that he then had meet every day in his conference room. And those 5 A-plus players, as he called them, that included Johnny Ive, his head of design that he discovered inside Apple. That was really who relaunched Apple, today the largest market cap company in the world. The third job then is culture, and that really aligns with the criticality of executing, and it requires a really great culture to do that. And then the fourth is their ability to utilize capital, their capital allocation capabilities. And by the way, for most small to mid-market companies, that's the area that they're the weakest. And it's one of the reasons why private equity firms and others, in a way, take advantage of entrepreneurs. So, strategy, the leadership team, culture, and their ability to allocate capital really aligns with our people, strategy, execution, and cash framework that, again, I didn't make up. But if you ask, and Tim Cook was asked, what is his job as the CEO of Apple? He said, I really have 3 focuses. And we've got a little 1-minute video. And he says, when he interviewed by the dean at Duke, people, strategy, and execution. He uses literally those 3 words. So we're not making it up. It really is coming from people I know at least much smarter than me, Michael.
No, but I think it's very interesting to find those elements. And also when we met each other in person, we were talking about it. Actually at Harvard University.
Yes.
So my question is also, how do we CEOs get those knowledge about strategy? So yes, we can read. How did you build up all the wisdom and knowledge?
Yeah. Well, we think it's the number one key performance indicator then for a CEO. And that is not the number of minutes, but the number of hours you spend in the market.
Yes.
Literally doing business with yourself. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners have tried doing business with their own company. Try calling your own phone number. Try placing an order. Try getting a quote. Try being service. It's horrifying. And so I don't know if you guys have been tracking, but about 4 weeks ago, the CEO and co-founder of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, gave a really significant interview in Silicon Valley. And Paul Graham, who is the founder of Y Combinator, then wrote a really significant blog post where he detailed the difference between founder mode and manager mode. And it is lit up Silicon Valley. And Fortune covered it, and Inc. covered it, and I've covered it. But in essence, what Brian really shared is that they could not get Airbnb going. They really messed around for 6 years trying to figure out the strategy that would work. And finally, Paul Graham comes in one day because they had talked their way into Y Combinator. And Paul goes, all right, where do you guys have your best customers? And they gave the standard answer every CEO does, found everyone, right? Everywhere. He goes, no. You've been in business for 6 years. Where do you have the most real customers? And they said, we have 20 beds in New York City. That was it. That was their biggest market. Now they're based in Silicon Valley. So Paul Graham said, guess what? You guys are packing up your bags and you're going to move to New York City and you're going to literally go live with your customers, which you can because it's Airbnb, and you're going to figure out what isn't working. Where's your strategy wrong? And they found it. It was only 2 things. They had really bad photos. They were letting their customers take photos themselves. And they had really bad descriptions. So they hired a photographer to make the beds look great, the rooms, and the descriptions better. And then they stayed in New York until they 10x from 20 to 200. The rest is history. So let's speed forward. Coming out of the pandemic, Airbnb stalled, and Brian could not figure out what was wrong. So everyone's probably aware, he chose to spend 6 months living and working out of Airbnbs. And he came off of that in 2023, a year ago. And he said, I found it. I found the one. And that's the key with strategy. You only need one innovation. You don't need 100. And the rest is history. They've had the best performing cash flow of any company on the Fortune 500 this year in 2024. And so it's a long answer to your really important question, Michael, which is where you get insight on strategy is not sitting at your desk. It is immersing yourself out in the marketplace and discerning what is the one, not the 10, not the 5, but the one thing you've got to do.
Thank you so much. So I understood now from your side as well that the product market fit you really get only if you're out with your customers, on your customer side or at your customer bedside in this case, to really, see what works, what is not working. And how do you get this customer focus, or also as Amazon has it in their values, how do you get it through the entire organization that they really, really live that? Customer obsessed, that they really have this customer obsession and customer first thinking?
Yeah, Michael, great question. And there I want to turn to Hermann Simon, Dr. Hermann Simon out of Germany, who wrote Hidden Champions of the 21st Century. What I love about Hermann, he's a mentor of mine for years, is that he studied us. Jim Collins really studied the Fortune 500, but Hermann studied family-owned, privately held companies that went on to own significant market share in very narrow niche. And as a result, had like software-like margins in what I would call kind of crappy businesses. And the key thing he found, one of 7, is that these hidden champions had twice as many employees directly interacting with customers than the non-hidden champions. Now, what does that mean? It's what Mark Zuckerberg's been doing at Meta, which was why he's now one of the top 5 wealthiest. The list came out this morning in the Forbes 400 list, is let's get rid of all this middle management and make sure that we have as many people that are customer facing as an organization than are not. I think the second thing, and since you mentioned Amazon, one of my favorite Jeff Bezos stories, and he said, that's why you've got to test the data. his kind of team was telling him that the customer was happy, that their response time, if you called in, was less than the average 60 seconds that they had set as a standard. But Jeff was hearing otherwise. He was picking up anecdotal information that they weren't really that good. So literally at their executive team meeting, it's a Monday, that's when they met. My good buddy David Risher was on their senior team, who's now the CEO of Lyft. Jeff decided to, all right, team, let's just call our phone number. He did it right in the meeting.
Wow.
And the phone rings, they get the automated attendant, and they're on hold for like 4 or 5 minutes. And he hangs up and he goes, guys, look, I don't know. I see what your data's saying, but this is what's going on.
Yeah.
And he was always adamant that sales and operation, Jeff Wilkie at the time and David Risher were his two guys, that they needed to be hooked at the hip and they had to be aligned around serving the customer. And as you know, sales and ops can be like this. And who else was like that was Michael Dell. Michael was very adamant that sales and operations should be hooked at the hip. And we have one job, and that is to serve the customer. So I think the key is just get a lot more market facing. I'd say a third example, and I want to go to my buddy Horst Schultz, who's the one who really scaled up Ritz-Carlton.
Yes.
He said there's no way our employees, he called them ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, he's hiring the same people everybody else is in the hospitality industry. But he made sure that they all stayed at a 5-star resort, either as a guest at the Ritz-Carlton or even with their competitors. He said, again, there's no way any of our team can understand what's required to service our customers if they're not a customer. Aflac, by the way, that's a company where customers have to file claims. It's an insurance firm. Every employee is required to file a claim.
Yeah.
So that they experience what that process is like. So it's not just the CEO that should go do business with themselves. You want to have all your employees do business with your own organization and see what it's like.
Yeah, such an important point. Thank you for that. I think it's so important to really also be your own customer, what you said. And in our onboarding, we were just, everybody on our platform has to create their own products like there would be a customer, and we buy from each other and sell to each other through our platform. I think that's quite interesting. Let's talk one more time, because we have a lot of CEOs also listening to the podcast. And in your book or books, you focus on habits that actually help business leaders to succeed. Can you maybe share what you believe are the most critical or daily or weekly habits a CEO should adopt to drive their business, the company's growth?
Yeah. And, one of the analogies, Michael, I use, if you're going to come visit my country, the U.S.,
Yes.
So I'm living now in Barcelona. I ask people, where is the safest place to be if you don't want to die? And it's a commercial aircraft. I mean, you want to be safe? You can't walk across the street and be as safe as you are in a commercial aircraft. And I share the numbers. And by the way, the numbers are similar in Europe.
Yes.
Between 2000 and 2009, there were 11 fatal crashes, 247 deaths. So roughly 25 a year, which, by the way, 60 people die from lightning strikes in the United States. You're more likely to die by being hit by lightning than on a commercial aircraft. But what's more significant is the next decade, the industry improved that by 100-fold. It went from 247 deaths to just 2. An entire decade of moving probably close to 1 billion people.
Right.
And what is the key to that? It is what the great medical doctor Atul Gawande wrote in his famous book, The Checklist Manifesto. The airline industry was the first to implement checklists.
Mhm.
And I don't care whether you're a mechanic or a pilot. And by the way, they're hiring the same people you are. They've probably had a fight with their spouse. They probably tied one on a little too long the night before. But as you and I do, we fly so much. I am so thankful that every mechanic and every pilot make sure that they do every item on the checklist. They don't just do the easy ones, the
Right.
ones they feel like doing, they do them all. And so that's why we have what's called the Rockefeller Habits Checklist. Our view is the CEOs that are listening and their senior teams are the pilots of their organization. And they should be as diligent about the checklist that's required to run a first-class organization. In fact, we have a client, they run about a $300 million solar company in Europe. Just name one of the fastest growing companies in Europe on a $300 million base. And the CEO actually has our checklist taped to his laptop so that every day he goes down through it and says, hey, are we doing these 10 things? But let me get right to your question. Our work can really be boiled down to 3 habits. First, the importance of setting priorities daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual, further out. Number 2, having a rhythm, a routine, a ritual of collecting data, both quantitative and qualitative, from customers, employees, and from the business, daily, weekly. And you then get in a room, and our third habit is our meeting rhythm. Does you no good to have that data if you don't get in a room and talk about it. So the first thing that Brian Chesky and Nate and his other co-founder did when they lost $1 billion worth of bookings on that Friday the 13th of the pandemic, I asked Nate on one of our virtual events, what's the first thing that you and Brian and the leadership team did? And they said, we got in a daily huddle 7 days a week, not just 5. We met every day. And if you want to move faster, you need to pulse faster. By the way, the first thing Steve Jobs did when he took over Apple was he got those 5 in a conference room and they met every day. By the way, what did he continue to do up until his untimely death? He had lunch every day with Johnny Ive, which was really the soul of the business, the heart of the business.
Right.
And so if you get in a room daily and you're looking at the right data, then you know where we have to go today and this week and this quarter. So priorities, data, and meeting rhythm are what we consider the 3 most important disciplines or habits that underpin what we call our Rockefeller habits.
Thank you for that. That's so powerful. In your experience now, also working with so many CEOs, what is maybe like the harsh truth that entrepreneurs need to confront, or especially CEOs, to achieve true growth?
It's a great question. I want to quote Jim Collins here, and that is to face the brutal facts.
Yes.
We want to sometimes deny that our product is wrong, that we've got the wrong product market fit, that we've got an executive on our team that's not really getting the job done. And these are really hard decisions. These sometimes are our friends that we've hired. They're colleagues that we've known for years. We're in love with our own product,
True.
Maybe the market shifts. And if you're not willing to face the brutal facts and make the hard decisions, and that's why I love Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Decisions About Hard Decisions,
Yes.
is so brutal. By the way, Michael, hopefully you'll come back to Harvard, our CEO Summit. I just booked Luda Kopakina to keynote next year.
Wow, nice.
Luda got her PhD. She was this Russian who came to the United States with $40 in her pocket.
Yes.
And got her PhD in decision making, CEO decision making. She wrote a book on it. And so we've got her coming to our summit to
Nice.
teach what it is that she learned about how to make these tough decisions and
Nice.
make them right. So to me, I think that is the toughest thing.
Good point. So making tough decisions. So what does it mean for a CEO making tough decisions? That means we should decide with speed, with data. Is there a wrong decision? Because also at the one hand, we have only the knowledge we have at this point, right? So maybe in a week from now, I would decide differently as a CEO as I would decide today. So the question is, should I give me now the week, or should I just say, guys, we all go left now?
That is exactly what Luda researched.
Yes.
She researched critical decisions CEOs made and when they got it right and when they got it wrong. And she identified a 4-step process. So the first step is, and it aligns with the creative process. You've got to do your work. You've got to do the homework. Like you making a decision with no insight from the market, like what Clay Christensen, the late Clay Christensen, taught
Yes.
in terms of
Yeah.
the job of a milkshake, unless you've been out there actually seeing it yourself firsthand, the intel. So it's called the 70-30 rule. You need to feel like you've got about 70% of the information you need before you attempt to make the decision.
Right.
You'll never have 100%. You don't have to wait till 80 or 90. And I know it's a judgment call, but
Yes.
she said roughly 70%. Then number 2, you have to calm yourself down. You actually need to get in a meditative state so that your brain gets out of its beta down to its alpha state.
Wow.
And that's the incubation. So if you want to do creative work, you have to, first of all, have the preparation.
Yes.
You got to go out and do the work. Then you need a period of incubation. For me, it's the shower. For the guy who invented the process for replicating DNA,
Yes.
it was a long drive. He's on this windy road in California when all of a sudden the answer came to him. So you've got to get very quiet. And that's why meditation is very important, and breathing and knowing how to calm yourself down very quickly is so important. Step 3 then is, she said, verbalize. You got to speak it. You can't just think it. We're a being that was given language 100,000 years ago. We were only given the written word 5,000 years ago. You need to speak out loud as if the decision was already made. We have acquired this company. And then at that moment, it's a body feel. You check in with your gut. You say, how does this feel? Then what you do is you state verbally the opposite. We declined acquiring this company.
Yeah.
And then you check in with your gut. And you see what your gut says. And by the way, they've discovered brain matter in both your gut and your heart. And the research is actually showing that this very unique biome we have in our gut that has a much more intricate DNA than our simple DNA as humans, that this is the source of decision making. And then it sends signals up to our server. And our brain's only up here so it stays cool. If our brain was in our gut, we'd burn up, right? Because this is putting off 20% of our, eating up 20% of our energy with 3% of the mass. And so there's really becoming a deeper understanding between checking in with both your heart and with your gut.
Yes.
And then let the brain process all of that in order to make the decision. So it's quite a precise process she's going to share with us.
Lovely. I will be there.
Summer.
It's very interesting.
Right.
So that means, with other words, there are certain things we sense, but we cannot articulate, or we cannot really say. That means, obviously, if we say with our guts, there's something more we cannot communicate about. It's interesting. I think also what Jeff Bezos says when he says, look, he only needs to do a few decisions per day, and that's about it, right? I think it's also important to focus as a CEO on the decision you should do, and especially on the ones you should not do, to also understand that your team should have the ownership and responsibility to also take certain decisions, right?
Well, and that's where I want to add to this conversation around founder mode.
Yes.
Because Paul Graham said it can be misused and it could end up giving the founder permission to micromanage and get their hands into too many places.
Right.
Here's my conclusion of this. The most important thing for the CEO to understand is what is the soul of the business.
Mm-hmm.
And then what it means to stay in founder mode is I'm giving founders, CEOs permission to remain maniacal
Yes.
about the soul. So, again, I'll give an example we're all familiar with, and then I'll give one of a smaller company. The soul of Apple was clearly what? Design.
Yes.
That was the soul.
Not
That was,
not innovation, if I may add.
no,
People say so much about they didn't invent the mouse.
no,
They didn't invent so
no,
much, right? It's interesting. Sorry, yeah.
design. And that's what Steve Jobs remained maniacal about. He would micromanage. He would be an a-hole when it came to design. And I give founders permission to be that maniacal about the soul. And that's why he had lunch every day with Johnny Ive. And the key thing he did is he found a guy, Johnny Ive, who cared as much or more than he did about design. So when he died, the company's valuation taxed during his death. Now, to me, the day Apple died was when Johnny Ive left in 2021. And there's usually a 36-month kind of cycle, 2 to 3 year cycle to get in. Let's see how the iPhone 16 does. But we've already seen Apple stock start to slip for the first time. And I think it's more because Johnny Ive is gone and there's nobody really watching out for the soul of Apple. So let me give an example of a smaller company. I'm on the phone 2 Fridays ago with a guy who heads up about a $600 million construction company. And he called me because he's grown this company from startup to 600 million. It's very well respected. He wants to step back and turn it over to some young new leaders that he's brought in. But he's going crazy. And I'm like, why are you going crazy? He said, I don't know. It just, something feels wrong. So then I said, all right, what got you here? How do you figure out the soul of a business? If your company's been successful, it has a soul. Now, if you're a CEO and your company's never been successful, you better figure out why. But if your company's been successful up to this point, I said, what was the key? What's the soul of the business? He knew it immediately, Michael. He lights up and he goes, we do very complex construction projects. And we have never, even when there were supply chain disruptions and all kinds of things, we never missed a deadline.
Amazing.
And
Yeah,
that was
very
our
interesting.
reputation. He said in the last 48 months, we've missed 4 deadlines. I said, I give you permission to go back and be maniacal about getting projects back on time. And I said, your job is to find a leader who cares as much or more about that than you. Otherwise, you can't step away until you do, or your company will be soulless. And what you can't scale is a company that is soulless. So what is the soul of the company? And then you have to make sure that that's where you spend your time.
Such a strong point. Thank you for that. I think you call it the soul. I call it a little bit the DNA of a business
Yes,
as well. So
yes,
now
yes,
you say, look, you need to have it in a leadership. You also mentioned the leadership at Apple defines
yes.
how it is. I mean, Apple 23 had over 160,000 employees. So is it really that a few people on top can make such a big difference?
That is what leaders do. There's no such thing as a leaderless team. And even if you look at a beehive and an ant colony, there is a queen.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not one that exists without it. Now, they don't do much, but they represent really the soul of the hive. And so, yes, the leader matters.
Thank you for that. I think it's very interesting, and also to be probably the role model as the leader. If design is for you so essential, if it's the soul of the business, if it is the DNA, you need to really live it and be almost sometimes a bit of a pain to your colleagues to really say, this is where we focus. I think that's so strong, and also make the right decisions to it. So let's talk about decision a little bit as well, because we talked about it earlier. Do we learn now from the decision where we have decided successful, or do we learn now from the decisions we have not been so successful? So do we learn from failures, or do we learn from success? And also later on, do we have to sharpen then, let's say, our strength, or should we focus on our weakness as CEOs and founders?
Yeah, Michael. So I want to share another story that I think underpins this. So there is, and are we frozen or can you hear me all right?
No, we can see each other perfectly because the recording will be uploaded separately. So my picture will be perfectly and you are as well.
I don't know. And I know you'll be able to edit this. So
yeah,
let me go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah,
and then hopefully you're going to come back on because it's being captured on my side
answer
here.
the question
so
again.
let me answer
our
your
recording
question
will
through
be
a story.
uploaded
I want
separately.
to take you to Spain.
If your internet is not strong enough, it will still, your video and voice, it will upload separately.
No, I know.
Okay. So the question was now, should we learn from the success or should we learn from the failure in regards to when we do decisions or in general? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You were froze for a long time. I checked my upload speed. It's still running strong on my end.
I also
and
checked
I'm 99% uploaded here.
Okay, I have speed test 530 megabits.
Yeah, I'm not as fast here because I'm in rural Colorado. Anyway, let me go ahead and answer because it's being recorded on this end.
Yes,
so
please.
Let me answer your question with a story. So I want to take you to Spain, kind of my adopted country, to the Torres family. They're 5 generations. They're winemakers, one of the largest in the world. And they have what's called a black book. And I've never heard of a family doing this. What it is anyone who makes a mistake, makes a really bad decision, has to go to the book and has to write up the decision, why it was bad, what we learned from it. And that's then shared when anyone's hired. The first thing they do is a big part of their training is to go back through what were all the lessons we learned in the black book. Because their belief is you learn as much or more from the bad decisions as you do the good decisions. So the story that the CEO, the 5th generation CEO shared was their CFO decided during one of the kind of crazy financial times that he wanted to take their cash and had some hedging strategies. And he asked the executive team if he should do it, and they all said no. But he did it anyway. And he ended up losing tens of millions of dollars when his hedges didn't pan out. Now, rather than fire him, because in a way, you just gave him a $40 million MBA, right? When it's a costly mistake, you just educated.
Absolutely.
But he had to go to the black book and he had to write up this mistake and what he learned from it and what everyone else can learn from it. And so I love that example. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Torres family has thrived for 5 generations.
Amazing. I think Thomas Edison also, there's also some saying that he also did similar things, writing down his mistakes and saying that he he found 1,000 ways that didn't work till he found the one way how the light bulb was actually lighting up. Very interesting. And
Yes.
the other part of the question was also, should we then sharpen our strength or should we work on our weaknesses?
Yeah, well, that's a loaded question. Marcus Buckingham in his book, his whole idea to play to your strengths, I think nailed it. It's more important. And by the way, here's how it applies.
Yes.
Let me tell you a mistake I made. So I'm helping a buddy of mine, Joe McKinney Lumber, scale from 1 million to 80 million, doing industrial pallets. And I would come in quarterly, and one quarter, he didn't call me to come back. And I called Joe up and I said, "Hey, Joe, I've helped you scale significantly. Why haven't you invited me back?" And he said, "Verne, because every time you visit, you depress me and my team. You are depressing." And I go, "Why?" He goes, "Because the first thing you do is you call up and say, 'What are all your problems?' And then you show up with the list, and we have to kind of go through all of those problems." I experienced the same thing when my ex and I were having troubles in our marriage, and we'd go to counselors, and the counselors, all they wanted to do was talk about what wasn't working. And I learned a valuable lesson and we've taught it to all of our coaching partners. I care more when I show up with a client to understand what is working. And let's do more of that instead of focusing so much on what's not working. Now, I don't want to put our head in the sand. I don't want to ignore challenges, but I think it's more important we play to our strengths and versus go try to fix weaknesses that might be against our very DNA. And that's why our tool, the sweat tool, we look at core competencies and core weaknesses. And it's understanding what at your core, what you're good at and what you suck at. And then what you got to do is avoid doing things that you're bad at,
Right.
and play to the company's strengths and play to your own strengths.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. What about now from your personal life? Because I mean, you build now so much wisdom up in the entire business category. What is something where you said, okay, that was one of a tough time, a failure, something where I really learned from, and I would love to share that because I think it's so important to, what was one of the milestones where I said, well, that really, made me who I am today.
Yeah, well, so when I launched my company back in 1997, we grew from 500,000 to 1 million to 2 million to 4 million. I'm going to 8 million. I'm going to be in our country what's called an Inc. 500 company. And I was out raising $10 million to do an acquisition. And all the money guys kept saying, "But Verne, you have a business model problem. You're running 42% gross margin. We really think it ought to be 55%. And I'm like, I had such hubris because I was doubling in revenue and I teach this stuff and I'm so smart that I ignored him. And I was dutifully losing money, which is what you did at the end of the 90s, right? That was the cool thing, was to lose money. And 9/11 hit, 2001. And I lost about $1 million overnight. And because I was growing so fast, growth sucks cash, I essentially lost the business. Like my dad had in the 73 recession. And that's when I got what you'd say I got religion. And I set as our priority for the next year, 2002, I wasn't going to be in this business if I didn't figure out how to do it at a 55% gross margin, which is what everybody that was advising me told me I needed to do, that I didn't have a viable business at 42%. And I ignored them until I almost lost the company. And we have not fallen below 55% ever again. So you really have to listen to people who know more than you do. And I let hubris get in my way.
Yeah. In your approach and also the frameworks, also from the books, it's quite, I would argue, straightforward. And you have everything quite organized. Like me as a German, I really love it. It's very organized. But now when I also go to Generation Z and other ones, they like to have still a lot of freedom and so on. So what do you think is also like a good business culture or also method to say, okay, we are more like the Marine Corps, to have it really structured and this is the way we go? Or would you say, is it more like as a creative approach to give a lot of freedom?
Yeah. So the analogy we've been using is that of the best performing asset class this century, and that is sports teams. Man,
Right.
if you owned a sports team this century, you became one of the wealthiest people on the planet. Not that money matters, but you've seen it. So we prefer to run companies like sports teams. And here's what we know. In every sport, there's boundaries,
Hmm.
right? It wouldn't be a sport if there weren't white lines, right? In soccer, you name the sport.
True.
It also wouldn't be a sport if there wasn't what? Rules.
Yes.
And that's
Guidelines.
why we have officials who are there to give a yellow card and, if need be, give somebody a red card and kick them out of the game. And so our view is routine actually sets you free. What you never want to do is play a game when people aren't abiding by the rules. And I don't care what your culture is, your country. If you're going to play football, soccer, we're all playing by the same rules. We all have the same size field. We all have the same white lines that we have to respect. And that's really the role of core values.
Hmm.
Those are the rules left for interpretation. And that's the role of the brand promises. And if you look at our vision summary, they serve as the guardrails. And so, yes, you can speed down the German highways. You have got the freedom. I love being on the Autobahns,
Same.
going unbelievable speeds, but
True.
there's still white lines. And
True.
if you go outside the white lines, somebody's going to get hurt. And so we actually think that gives people more freedom than less to know the rules and believe that everybody's playing by them and that the leadership is holding people to those rules. If you're not passing out yellow cards and a few red cards inside your company, no one's going to take your rules seriously. And
Thank you,
that's why
Verne.
they're
Yeah.
critical.
I think very good point. And I just saw yesterday a study that on the German Autobahn, the death rate is actually a lot lower than any other country having a highway with a speed limit. And the reason is really that the Germans just stick to the rules, because when you go unlimited with your car, you cannot, go by on the right side, or do not use your flash, like your lights, etc. So I think that that's quite important to do that.
It's interesting. So when President Carter
Yes.
lowered the speed limit in the United States, I was then involved in the Reagan administration. I actually gathered those death rate statistics from
Wow.
Germany and showed that we had a much higher death rate at the lower speed limits than we did at the higher speed limits. And that's why our speed limit was so crazy in this country. I'm glad we've gotten it back up, but it's precisely, and I hate driving in the United States. Slow drivers drive in the left lane. You never do that in Europe,
Yeah,
or
no,
or
absolutely. And
you're
that's the point.
or you're going to get run over.
Absolutely. And also using your signals. That was the word I was looking for earlier. So that's important. And they just stick to the rules. I just was there yesterday in Germany, so I thought it's quite interesting.
And
Um,
we get more freedom. That's the point.
True. Let's
Rules
talk.
give us more freedom.
Absolutely. It's a good point. We need rules in business.
Yeah.
We
And
see
boundaries.
also, yeah, and boundaries and guidelines. And I think that's very important. On the other hand, let's also talk a little bit sometimes when the macro effects hit in, when things are not going so well. And I know you're also doing a very interesting lecture or talk about the 5 C's for leadership in a crisis. So what can you tell us here in a nutshell? How should we as CEOs and founders act if a crisis hit us, like COVID, like something else, financial
Yeah.
crisis or other things?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And we do have a lot of companies hurting right now. And that's why your mindset, what's between your two ears is so critical. And so we opened the pandemic with two initial thoughts. And that's what I'm going to open my webinar today with.
Mm-hmm.
And first was from Greg Brenneman. Greg's the guy who turned around Continental Airlines, PwC, Burger King. He's got a company called Turnworks. And he's the guy sent in to turn around companies that are in a crisis. And the first thing he says to the leaders, your job is to absorb fear and exude hope. I'll say that again. Your job's to absorb fear and to exude hope. And that's not fair that that's your burden, but that's why you signed up to be leader. If you're not willing to do that, then step aside and bring in a leader who's willing to do it. And that's why you get paid the median bucks.
Yes.
Now, what does that mean then to exude hope? And Margaret Heffernan, then I had her as the second speaker, said there's only one strategy, and that is to remain ambitious. And the way to think about it is what this famous F1 Formula race car driver out of Brazil said. You can't pass any cars when it's sunny, but you can pass 15 cars when it's raining. And so I think your mindset has to be, my gosh, everyone in my industry is probably facing exactly the same chaos. Interest rates, inflation, supply chain challenges. We've got a port strike going on right now that could cripple our country as we speak in the United States. This is the time for you to put the pedal to the metal, get on the Autobahn,
Yes.
and pass some cars. But it requires the first C is frequent communication.
Mm-hmm.
And it literally means get in and talk daily. If you're not doing the daily huddle, you've got to make sure your team is huddled up daily. That Steve Jobs did in turning around Apple, and Brian Chesky and the team at Airbnb did when they lost that $1 billion that Friday the 13th in the pandemic. So you've got to first and foremost really communicate clearly and daily. Second of all, you've got to you don't have a strategy if you didn't name it. And so when Hubert Joly was brought in to turn around Best Buy, and you got to remember, it's the recession. Circuit Cities just failed. Amazon's coming in and killing big box retailers like Best Buy. This was the perfect storm. But the first thing he did was he gave his turnaround strategy a name. He called it Renew Blue.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, here are the 5 things we have to do. And so your job is to set strategy. And the key thing is give it a name, give it a rallying cry.
Right. People
can point to. No military mission, including Top Gun Maverick. If you saw the movie, that mission was called Dagger. We're going to put a dagger in that uranium facility. And he called each of the 4 teams Dagger 1, Dagger 2, Dagger 3, Dagger 4. So you've got to communicate a clearly defined turnaround strategy. And then 3, you got to watch cash. You got to make the tough decisions as quick as possible because you can get by with decent people, decent strategy, decent execution, but not a day without cash. And if you got to sell some things, which by the way, we saw in the turnaround of GE last year, the first thing they did was sell off something that could load them back up with cash so they could weather the storm. And there's a couple other C's, but we'll cover those on the webinar. And I've got another one that's coming up here in a few minutes, so I've got to jump on it.
So final question, future trends. Based on your extensive experience with different organizations, what trends would you say or do you see sharpen over the next decade? What the business owners and CEOs should look at, and how can we adapt those changes?
Yeah. There's 3 trends. AI, and AI.
All starts with A.
There is no other trend you better be on.
Right.
And I wrote my latest column in Chief Executive was called A Player plus AI. You've got 2 things to do. Make sure you've attracted and retained the sharpest A-plus players you can. And then you've got to arm yourself with AI. And I'll just tell you a quick final story. So we do these CEO boot camps. and I do these one-on-one sessions. This year, I've had as my sidekick ChatGPT 4.0. So literally, I'll have it up on a screen when a CEO and COO come in for a one-on-one, and it's unbelievable. The insights, given the constraints that we're addressing in that one-on-one,
Yes.
the insights that AI, that ChatGPT is able to provide. I'll give you a very precise example. So we have a client, one of the clients, about 800 million in revenue. They have 600 assets right now being very well deployed in a crisis, the hurricane, Helene, that we've got. They have 600 water trucks and fuel trucks. The problem is last year there wasn't a single disaster. So the question is, what could they do with those assets without tying them up? Because they're probably going to need in this disaster to be there for 6 months. We put that to ChatGPT, those very precise, you have to know how to prompt. And it came back with 8 options.
Wow.
That were highly viable. That's the precision.
Yeah.
It is your sidekick. So
it is a
figure
game
out
changer.
8 players plus AI.
So AI is not an option anymore; it's a must to have. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Absolutely.
for the chat. I really enjoyed it. So many nuggets, so many insights.
All
I'm
right.
excited to get things implemented.